It's the latest edition of Shadow Talk, your weekly cybersecurity and digital risk podcast. Today we cover the hidden Cobra FASTCash campaign alert issued by the US authorities, detailing ATM cash-out campaigns performed by North Korean actors. We also look over the Five Eyes joint report into publicly available hacking tools. If you've never heard of China Chopper, Mimikatz or PowerShell, then I recommend you stick with us for the lowdown. And finally, are companies who use MSPs at greater risk of attack? We bring in DS CISO Rick Holland to debate the issue with the wider team. All this today on Shadow Talk. So it's been a busy couple of weeks and we've assembled our big hitters to provide their analysis of some of the big reports that have made the news. As always, we have Dr. Richard Gold, Director of Security Engineering, we've got Simon Hall, Senior Security Engineer, and seeing as we had him in London this week, it's another appearance from Rick Holland, CISO here at Digital Shadows. How are we all?
Pretty good, thanks.
Oh, good here, thank you.
Good to go.
Cool, so let's crack on. So the first story is this FASTCash hidden Cobra alert. So at the beginning of October, the US CERT issued a joint technical alert from work done by the Department of Homeland Security, the US Treasury, and the FBI, as well as some government partners, identifying malware used by North Korean threat actors in an ATM cash-out scheme, which they referred to as FASTCash. Now, the alert claimed that the activity was performed by the North Korean government or their agents, and they referred to the activity as the Hidden Cobra Group. So what are some of the most significant tactics being used in the FASTCash scheme?
Well, I think the first thing which struck me is that the North Korean government is acting like a financial criminal group, knocking over banks, financial institutions, left, right, and center. So that's kind of a bit of a sci-fi aspect to this.
It's a great way to get around sanctions.
It's a great way. Well, that's sweet cryptocurrency and fraudulent payments. So what they did, as the alert describes, is that they compromised some of the payment switch servers and used that to redirect messages which were handling the transactions, and they used that to block any kind of attempt by the payment system to reject its transactions. So they were able to allow basically their fraudulent transactions to go through unaffected. And it was based as well on, they were hacking like AIX, which is like the old IBM Unix. Yeah. You remember that from the good old bad old days.
Yeah, I'm old. If I know AIX, I may or may not have worked that in my career. Yeah, you're old.
It's a legacy system, I think it's fair to say. And it's interesting that how they got there is not clear. I think that's something which is missing from the alert. Probably they fished their way in, moved laterally, and found their way to the juicy stuff. But for me, what's remarkable is that they were very happy to go after an old legacy Unix. So that security by obscurity clearly is not working for these guys.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that kind of screamed opportunistic, that they were looking for the unsupported, unpatched systems. Yeah, I mean, the lateral movement was briefly mentioned at one point, but they don't really go into detail on how that occurred. But they were saying they were inside for about up to 155 days, which is plenty of time to sit and monitor someone's movements and grab jump box credentials or whatever else to move your way through. So yeah, I mean, it's most likely a phishing inside and then just wait for the right opportunity to move.
Yeah, and the alert also calls out this ISO standard, this ISO 8583 standard for financial transaction messaging, and how the actors knew a lot of detail about this standard, and they used that to subvert the libraries. And the alert says
we see this a lot with all of the banking attacks, though. The Russians or the Chinese or whoever, they all seem to have some inside knowledge or background in this, how these systems work.
Yeah, exactly, Simon. So it's something we discussed, I think, last time we talked about Fin7. They seem to have a very detailed understanding of what are sometimes quite esoteric
it was also
systems and processes.
The Carbonac or not Carbonac, whatever the bootstrap, the source code leak. Inside of that, there were these documents describing the entire fraudulent how the fraud detection stuff worked. And here, they said that they knew how the libraries which interpret financial request messages and able to properly construct fraudulent financial response messages. And they really are into the details of the business processes. I think that's what's interesting with these actors for me. It's not just, they can fish, they can run Mimikatz.
Who should be worried about this then? So the alert said that they had not confirmed any FASTCash incidents affecting US institutions. Is this only directed at FS? Is it broader than that?
The alert just talks about banks in Africa and Asia and says, they haven't observed this particular TTP happening in the US. I think that if you're running legacy AIX, well, that's a concern in itself. But I'm sure it's very stable. That's what these people are targeting. So that's obviously a concern. But in general, I think the broader point is that these financially motivated threat actors are getting to know your business processes, and if there are weaknesses there, they're going to find it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think those standards are obviously different between different countries for financial systems. So in the US, it's probably a lot harder to find an unsupported public-facing server or one that's easier accessible from a jump box.
And what are some of the solutions here? Is there anything specific that deviates from some of the traditional advice we hear?
And unsupported systems are a big no-no.
Isolate, segregate.
Yeah, it's probably a lot of isolate and segregate, because I don't know about this particular application in this particular enterprise, but many organizations have legacy apps that they cannot get rid of. At one point in my career, I worked in a university and we did research, and we had devices at that time that ran NT4, and there was nothing that we could do. And this is well past the days of NT4 being out there. So really we are encumbered by legacy systems and trying to set up visibility in and out of those environments with other tools. Just understanding that footprint in your environment where you have those legacy systems is so critical. And you'll see these large digital transformation projects where people are trying to replace a legacy system and move to something that's in a service provider environment, which we're going to touch on in a little bit as well. There's a lot of challenges associated with that. But really got to have some additional controls in place when you have these systems that are 20 years old, 30. It's kind of interesting. You almost have the problem that the ICS companies have, except it's a financial platform, but it's been in the environment for about the same time of those platforms.
Yeah, it's like the upgrade cycle is pretty much the same actually as an ICS system. I think you mentioned, some of my favorite points there. You've got to know your environment. You've got to know what you have. You've got to find out if you have this stuff. Maybe you have it, you don't even know about it. Who knows? But there's getting to know the environment and then the monitoring. So if you can't, as you say, in many cases, you can't get rid of something, it's a business critical process. There is no other replacement. You're stuck with it. Then you just got to monitor the hell out of that environment and make sure that anything that's coming in, something you know about.
Yeah, definitely. With the legacy stuff, like from my pen testing background, I see this everywhere. But it is down to how you handle that risk and the kind of segregation and the access controls around it. So if you're doing that, then fine. Everyone expects that, especially older organizations, they're going to have legacy equipment, but there are ways of maintaining that and making it secure.
Thank you for that, guys. Moving on, Rick just mentioned it a second ago, we're going to talk about managed service providers. And the reason for that is there's a story of ongoing APT, advanced persistent threat activity, where attackers are trying to infiltrate networks of global managed service providers. Now, when I read this, I thought, is this really a surprise? An MSP seems to be a pretty attractive target for an attacker. And I want to open this up, keep it more like a debate style. Question here is, does this mean that using MSPs actually makes organizations somewhat more at risk?
Well, that's a really nice leading question, but yeah, it's absolutely something which is not set. Right? It's not like there is a black and white, this is right, this is wrong answer. It's case by case. Who is the MSP? Is it somebody who that's very trustworthy? There's all MSPs, like any companies, they exist on a spectrum, and some of them are more secure, and some of them are unfortunately less secure. But just as before we maybe talk about that, we could just touch on the fact that they were doing the APT groups were doing the usual stuff, right? They stole credentials, they got hold of privileged accounts, and then they used either built-in tools to pull data out of the system, or they used the standard pen test tools, Powersploit and others to get the job done. So they may be, the targets is an interesting discussion. The tradecraft is pretty standard stuff. But yeah, if you put, the saying is, don't put all your eggs in one basket, but you can put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket.
I was saying earlier, it's a bit similar to the argument with password managers. You put all your passwords in one place. Are you then increasing the attack surface? You have everything there. If someone gets access to that, then potentially very dangerous. But then you have very good password managers. You have ones which are a bit less reputable. All depends. And that shouldn't mean that you then start basically acting unsafely online as well. You still got to...
Yeah, and that's the thing we touched on, right? That it doesn't mean that you abdicate responsibility just because you're using an MSP.
Yeah, I mean, any third party you use, you're running the risk of adding a larger attack surface. MSPs in general, yes, you're giving them a lot more control. So you've got to do your vetting, you've got to do your third party reviews to make sure that they're following the best practices, because they're not always doing that.
Well, you've got to do your little tick box surveys for your service providers. An area of great fun for me internally here at Digital Shadows. I think the majority of organizations are going to be in a better position with a well-vetted managed service provider than they could be otherwise. An example, and it's not a managed service provider, but it's called a service provider. If you think about Office 365, I think that Microsoft is going to do a far better job of email security than you could with an Exchange server online or a little postfix box running in a closet. Now, of course, it's not quite that contrast. You still have large companies, but you're running the service in the cloud. You're going to get the business continuity, disaster recovery benefits. But of course, as we have seen, and actually Office 365 is a good thing to mention, 3-4 weeks ago, we saw some outages there in Azure as well. So, I think from my perspective as a CISO, you get a lot of benefit from going to a service provider, but you do have to vet them and probably importantly, not set an expectation that because you went with someone that it's going to solve all your problems, that you're going to have service that never goes down. You're still going to have challenges, but I think the service providers are going to be more resilient than you could be on your own.
So Rick, on that, using your CISO hat, what is it you're looking for when you're selecting a managed service provider? What are some of the things that you are evaluating and considering? Because we said if it is a spectrum, for listeners, if they're contemplating employing one, or what is it they should be looking for?
Well, I always recommend, and I would see this at Forrester as I worked with the MSSPs with response to incident response and threat intelligence. I would always go to my peer group, and even now on any decision that I make, I like to talk to other CISOs of technology companies, cybersecurity companies, and see what they're using for whatever it is, infrastructure as a service, SaaS, managed service provider. So, the peer group for me of someone that's like me or like us is an area that I like to go. Of course, you do the things that you have to do. Do they have a SOC 2, ISO certification, those sorts of things. Now, one of the things I will do with Digital Shadows, the whole eat your own dog food, we use Searchlight here as customers. And we have a lot of collection on third parties. So I can go out and look in our password database as an example. Kind of it doesn't mean that it's 100% guarantee that they're going to be good or bad, but I can see
it's an indication.
It can use it as a data point. And Simon actually helps us out on our third party risk assessments. You can look at our credential store and see how much does this SaaS provider have. I actually am more concerned about a SaaS provider that's a small company than I am about a large managed security services provider, right? To me, I'm more worried about the SaaS providers, and I want to evaluate what kind of data do they have. I like to call all data toxic data because it's dangerous to us. We want to have a program in place where we expire our data. We don't keep data forever. And all of this is a journey for us. I'm not saying that we're the perfect security company like everyone else. It's a work in progress. But I personally am very, very concerned about the 100-person or less SaaS company and the type of data that they may have, from intellectual property to personally identifiable data to health data to GDPR data. You always want to have that that assessment and understand the risk that you put with the service provider.
Yeah, as you say, you can't have unrealistic expectations. So what are you going to do when there's an outage? So you need to have that plan. If you're hosting a service yourself, and even if you're using a managed service provider, you still have to have that plan in place, and you still have to consider that, because we've seen even Amazon has had outages that were quite significant. And of course, you don't expect them to happen often, but you still need to have some kind of contingency in place when that event does happen.
Even Slack goes offline, and when Slack goes offline, I mean, I actually have to turn around, look 1 foot away from me, and speak to someone.
It's a nightmare.
So sometimes I don't. I just hold it because the Slack will be back in about 30 minutes. So I just wait for all verbal comms till I can go back to Slack.
Or Twitter.
I DM. I switched to DMs.
That's what Signal's for, though, isn't it?
Right.
Great. Moving on to our final story of the week. So the topic here is a joint report by Five Eyes. So that's the intelligence agencies of the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And their report highlights the use of 5 publicly available tools which they've observed in recent cyber incidents around the world. And this report also contains advice on how to detect and limit their activity on your network. So Rich, you really liked this report. What was it specifically that
what I really liked about this report was that it talks about the sort of things that most organizations have to be concerned with. These are publicly available tools. Some of them are open source tools like Mimikatz, PowerShell Empire, that you sometimes we get too carried away by the attribution, the nation states, the O-Day, and this kind of stuff, and we forget that there are the fundamentals we have to have in place, and this is what threat actors are using. So it's like you have to be this high sign on the roller coaster, right? You've got to be protecting against these publicly available tools, and all pretty well known, but organizations consistently fail to defend against them for a variety of reasons. But they in the report they break down what the tool does. So they talk about a remote access Trojan, a web shell, credential sealer, lateral movement, C2, and how the tools work, what they do, how you can detect and protect against them, and examples of their usage. One of them that particularly struck me was they talk about February 2018, UK energy sector company was compromised, and these threat actor was using PowerShell Empire, and the weak credentials, one of the admin accounts, is how they got in initially, and then they were using like a standard open source toolkit that we've used in our tests, that I've written code for, that it's nothing special in that sense. It's not
say about your own work.
Yeah, I generally agree.
Yeah, it's not, you don't have to, you can just go to the GitHub page and clone it and use it,
I think we've touched on this before. They'll use whatever works for the situation. They're not going to customize or create their own tools for everything. When you've got Mimikatz and Empire and PowerSploit out there, they'll do pretty much everything for you.
Yeah, and have to also, was very, very impressed to see that Digital Shadow's blog on PowerShell security practices was cited in the Five Eyes report as a good summary. So, that was pretty nice touch.
Yeah, and we'll put a link to that PowerShell blog. It's a really good overview of what PowerShell is, breaks it down really nicely, really digestible. We'll put a link to that in the description of the podcast today. And it's just another reminder to check out our resources page on our website, where you can find all the different content and blogs and the latest research papers from our team.
One thing, if I'm putting the CISO hat back on, I don't know what hat I'm taking off when I do that, but one thing that I think could be useful if you're trying to justify spend as a security leader, this is a nice rundown on tools. You can take, in the US, you can take the US CERT alert on this as well and use it to help justify an endpoint detection and response tool. Like, these are the tools that are out there that are using normal things that look like normal system administration activities. Use that to help justify it. I'm always looking for Verizon DBIR, US CERT alerts, alerts like this one that was obviously much broader than the US CERT, as a third party that I could use to help validate my strategy. And right now it's probably an opportune time for those out there in internet land. I'm in London right now for 2019 planning. And all of our teams were doing 2019 planning. Last week, Rich was in Dallas, and we were doing internal security research planning. So this could be a nice little report to use to maybe point to as third-party validation of a strategy that you're looking towards, and you want to have something that could support your proposal to your CFO on it.
And it's very pragmatic. Yeah, that's what I liked about it. It's like, these are the things that we see very frequently. These are very, very common tools. They're very widely available. So you're not sort of like boxing yourself into a corner by trying to address the concerns which these tools throw up. So they are, things that everybody has to worry about, like dealing with the web shell, making sure that people can't just upload random code onto your web servers and things like this. It's really pragmatic, and it's really concrete. And I think let's get this stuff sorted first before we worry about attackers using AI to, I don't know, whatever.
That could be our new tagline: attackers using AI for, I don't know, whatever.
On that grand note, it's time to probably wrap up this episode of the podcast. So we'll just go around the table here and get a few takeaways. We'll discuss a lot of things. So if each of you could just give me one specific point of what we discussed, or something that's on your mind that you want our listeners to take away. Rick, can you kick us off?
Third-party risk, I actually think we should do a podcast episode and just dig into third-party risk, because I could go down this rabbit hole quite a bit. So I don't know. My takeaway is we need to have a deeper conversation on third-party risk and look for ways to do it better. Rich, what about you?
Yeah. So for me, I think everything just comes back around again, right? It's all about the fundamentals. If you look at these three different stories that we've talked about, at the end of the day, it still comes back to doing the basics, getting the fundamentals in place. It's the isolation, it's patching, it's credential hygiene, and which are difficult things to do. I don't want to trivialize it, but again, that's, you've got to focus on getting the fundamentals in place, and I think all three of these stories really illustrate that.
Yeah, I think for me, around the kind of the common tooling that's used, just following the mitigations that, for instance, in this particular report gave, are not going to only protect you against those tools, but they're also going to protect you against tools that do the same techniques, which is the most of them, really. So all tooling, even custom tooling, are generally going to follow standard techniques. So following mitigation for a particular product will cover you for a majority of them as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I fully agree with that. Yeah, if you're protecting, if you follow the mitigation advice for like dealing with lateral movement that Empire does, it's going to help you against the commercial stuff like Cobalt Strike and
exactly
toolkits that are out there.
So follow best practices.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. Okay, great. So that's the end of our podcast. If you've enjoyed the discussion, if you take issue with anything that we've said, or you want to join in, you can always reach us at our Twitter account, which is @Digital Shadows. And thank you for listening. See you next week.